I showed up unexpectedly at my wife's special party. When she saw me, she couldn't believe it, and the shock on her face confirmed what I feared. She hadn't expected me to witness her intimate embrace with another man. I didn't wait for an explanation, I simply turned my back and let the silence engulf what words could no longer save. She tried to chase after me later, but her lover disappeared as soon as the spell wore off. Alone, she faced the emptiness she'd chosen. I, after the pain, found calm again alongside a new love, someone who offered me truth without asking for anything in return. When she came to me, repentant, I looked into her eyes and said, "I forgive you, but I'm not coming back. Our chapter is over." And so, we moved on. And that's when she realized the weight of her choice. What breaks suddenly, in front of everyone, was never truly sudden. What breaks in a second had already been unraveling silently for a long time. I was only the last to know. And when I did, it was in the most brutal way anyone can discover the death of a story, before their eyes, before a smile too strange to be innocent, before hands that no longer knew how to disguise the intimacy of another body. The worst thing about betrayal is not what it causes, but what it reveals, that while you were fighting for us, the other had already chosen me long ago. I was there, standing at the door of that stupid party, holding the gift box with sweaty hands and a slight smile on my face, just wanting to see her happy. And what I found was a look of guilt that pierced me like a silent bullet. The kind of pain that doesn't scream, but corrodes. The kind of pain that ages you inside, in seconds. She froze when she saw me, but it wasn't the kind of paralysis of someone overcome with emotion. It was the kind of paralysis of someone caught. As if time had stopped just for her. And perhaps it did, because it was at that exact moment that something in her died, and I only buried it later. Her eyes met mine with a silent plea, but there was no further dialogue possible. The embrace I saw wasn't just physical, it was intimate, it was complicit, it was revealing. And the most desperate thing was that, even with the deafening silence that followed, I knew she wanted to run after him. And she did. But he had nowhere to run when the ground itself collapsed beneath his feet. Her lover vanished like smoke, as all cowards do when reality begins to outweigh illusion. And I withdrew. Not out of pride. But out of respect. Not for her, for me. Because some things, when they break, don't stick together. Not with 1,000 apologies, not with tears, not with longing. The pain came in waves. It wasn't all at once. It was gradual. It was when I tried to sleep the next day and turned to the wrong side of the bed. It was when I looked at the toothbrush that was still there, as if nothing had happened. It was when I heated up the coffee and remembered she preferred it cold. It was when I opened the closet and saw the blouse she wore when she stayed home on Sundays, pretending we still loved each other as before. It was in every corner of the house. In every corner of my memory. In every silence. Betrayal, sometimes, hurts more for the emptiness it leaves than for what it destroys. Because it destroys, yes, but what remains is the absence of what once was. It's the poisoned doubt, when did everything start to die and I didn't notice? It's the feeling of having lived a lie that seemed so true that to this day I wonder if I was stupid or just too in love. But time is both cruel and generous. It gives you distance. And with it comes clarity. Little by little, the pain turned to dust, and the dust turned to learning. And when I least expected it, I found someone who looked at me without knowing anything about my past, yet saw me whole. Someone who asked for nothing in return, who didn't compare me to anyone else, who didn't make me prove every day that I was enough. It was strange to be loved again, without fear, without distrust, without half-truths. I found myself rebuilding ruins that I didn't even know were still standing. I relearned to smile without thinking about what I'd lost. I learned that life goes on, and that true love doesn't need promises, it proves itself in constancy. And that was when she returned. Remorseful. Thinner. Sadder. More broken. With eyes that were once alive now downcast, as if carrying the weight of their own mistake. Her voice trembled as if speaking to a ghost. And in a way, it did. Because the one she betrayed, died the day he was betrayed. What remained was another man, a man at peace, but who would never be the same again. She tried to explain herself, tried to cry, tried to rebuild something with words that no longer held power. "I lost myself," she said. "And I found myself," I replied. And that was it. The end doesn't need noise. Sometimes it comes with a simple, firmly said no. She still tried to get closer afterward. She appeared from time to time with silly excuses, as if the life she destroyed could be swept under the rug. But the truth is, when someone shows who they are, you have to believe. And I believed. I believed she was capable. And that's what saved me. But she couldn't move on. She was trapped in her own mistake, and her regret wasn't pretty, it was cruel. It was like an emotional illness that wouldn't go away. Time didn't heal, it only intensified the pain. Because she didn't just lose her husband, she lost the man who loved her unconditionally. She lost her home, her complicity, her best friend. And when the silence passed, only the echo of her own voice remained, whispering the name of someone who was no longer there. At night, alone, she relived that scene like a recurring nightmare, her at the party, the other man in her arms, her husband at the door, the shocked look, the absence of words. It became the movie that played every time she closed her eyes. Time became torture. And the guilt, punishment. One day, years later, I was told she'd started having panic attacks. That she'd wake up in the middle of the night, shaking, as if she'd seen a ghost. But it wasn't a ghost. It was herself. It was the part of her that was left behind. Regret is a kind of prison without bars. And she lived between the memories of what she lost and the terror of never being loved the same way again. Because no matter how many loves come after, none will be the one you destroyed with your own hands. No look will shine the same way. No laugh will be as light. No touch will carry the same weight. When you betray a true love, it's not the other you lose. It's yourself. And she realized it. Too late. What she never knew, and perhaps never will, is that there was a night I almost went back. Just one. It was raining. I'd had a few drinks. I looked at my phone and thought, is there still a way back? But before I could type anything, I remembered the pain. I remembered her face, the embrace with another, the feeling of being left behind like something disposable. And I took a deep breath. I deleted the message. I turned on the television. And I went to sleep next to the one who never made me doubt myself. Perhaps this is the greatest punishment for those who betray, knowing they were loved by someone who will never be loved again. And losing that forever. Because there are mistakes we forgive, but never forget. There are pains that become scars, but burn when the rain comes. And there are stories that, even beautiful ones, end, not for lack of love, but for too many lies. But what happened to her after all this? Did she find redemption? Or does she still live inside that nightmare, searching for a way back that no longer exists? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize and never support any form of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry profound truths. Our purpose is clear: show how betrayal destroys homes, corrodes feelings and leaves scars that time cannot erase. Prepare to immerse yourself in an intense narrative, where every choice has a price, and not every regret finds forgiveness. Now take a deep breath, and get ready to hear a shocking story. They met on a random Saturday, the kind where fate pretends to be chance. He, with a smile that spoke before words, and she, with a restless look, the kind that hides too many questions. His name was Daniel. Hers, Laura. There was something between them that developed silently, as if time had slowed down just to watch them form. It was in a small coffee shop, muffled by the late afternoon noise, that their eyes met for the first time, and since then, nothing has been light again. Not because the relationship was heavy, but because what blossomed there was dense. It was too deep to be casual. Within a few months, they were completely immersed in each other, with a naturalness that startled even the most skeptical. Conversations stretched on for hours, touches were intentional, and the silence between them was comfortable. There were no overly ambitious plans, no rush, just that absurd desire not to lose each other in the world. Daniel was always the kind of man with a calmness in his eyes that few know how to cultivate. He worked in architecture and had a discreet sensitivity that revealed itself in the details, like when he realized Laura needed silence or when he made breakfast on Sundays without her asking. He wasn't one for grand gestures, but the small ones carried the weight of someone who loves consistently. He had a common past, without significant traumas, and a childhood marked by present parents and a stable home. He didn't know much about deep pain, but he knew about presence, about listening, about care. Laura, on the other hand, was more intense, more fickle. She was a literature teacher and carried in her chest a universe of emotions that sometimes even she couldn't translate. She lived her feelings loudly, spoke with her hands, had fits of laughter, and cried watching perfume commercials. She had a difficult relationship with her father, who left home when she was still young, and this shaped a certain fear of abandonment that she masked with irony and independence. At first, these differences seemed like a perfect fit. He brought peace, she brought color. And together, they created a routine that, to outsiders, resembled one of those stories people wish for themselves. They lived in a spacious apartment, filled with plants and books, where time seemed to pass differently. Simple candlelit dinners, repeat movies on Fridays, playlists to listen to in the car, plans for vacations, everything seemed to fall into place. Friends said they complemented each other, that they were unlike anything they'd ever seen. And perhaps they were. Because there was truth there was surrender. At least for a while. The building of that love was done patiently. With every piece of furniture they bought together, with every silly argument they learned to resolve without yelling, with every holiday spent with their families, with every night they cared for each other during a cold or an anxiety attack. Daniel knew when Laura needed space, and Laura knew when Daniel needed silence. They learned each other's rhythm. And it took time. Long enough for them to believe they would be together forever. Not because they had promised it out loud, but because everything around them seemed to push them in that direction. His parents adored Laura. Her friends swooned over Daniel. Their affinity was so evident that even strangers commented. When they walked down the street together, there was something in their gestures, in their looks, that made it clear they had a solid love. But no love survives on what's visible alone. Intimacy is also built on what's unseen. And over time, small noises began to accumulate. Not fights, not betrayals, not disrespect. Just silences. Silences that once were comfort and now were distance. Laura began to be quieter than she spoke. Daniel began arriving home late from work, justifying things with projects that, in fact, existed. There were no lies, but there was distance. A distance that crept in without them realizing it, like dust accumulating on furniture no one cleans anymore. Candlelit dinners were replaced by meals in front of the television. Long conversations gave way to shallow questions. Touching became scarce. Desire still existed, but it was like an ember that needed more air to stay alight. Laura missed the intensity. Daniel missed the lightness. Neither of them could say it clearly, and so they continued to feign normalcy. They smiled in photos, attended events together, held hands at the movies. But something was missing. And they knew it. Still, they persisted. Because giving up seemed too cowardly. Because there was history. Because there were too many memories along the way. Because sometimes, it's easier to keep going than to face the end. Laura tried to rekindle what she felt. She bought gifts, suggested trips, left notes around the house. Daniel reciprocated with affection, with kindness, but something in his gaze betrayed the emotional exhaustion he couldn't name. Neither of them had done anything unforgivable. Neither of them wanted to hurt. And perhaps that's why the pain was even more cruel. Because there was no villain. There were just two people slowly losing each other. But even as they lost each other, there were still moments. An ordinary day, an unexpected dinner, a tighter hug, a silly laugh. And those moments sustained everything. Made it all worthwhile. And maybe that was what kept them going. The hope that their love hadn't died, it was just sleeping. Laura believed it was just a phase. Daniel, deep down, wanted to believe it too. And so, they continued. They continued waking up together, sharing the same roof, making plans that seemed automatic. They didn't know it, but they were becoming experts at hiding cracks. They knew how to smile at the right moments, they knew what the other wanted to hear. And so, they spent months. Months trying to save something that seemed to slip through their fingers. But not every fall is loud. Some are slow, almost imperceptible. Like a love that slowly fades, without anyone having the courage to turn on the light and face what was left behind. It was in this interval, in this space between what was and what should have been, that decisions began to emerge. Small decisions. Silent choices that change everything without us even realizing it. An unannounced departure. A new cell phone number. A schedule that stretches too far. A different perfume. Nothing was clear yet. But the changes began to take their toll. Laura, though still present, was emotionally absent. Daniel, though affectionate, seemed to live with half his soul elsewhere. Even so, the affection endured. On lazy Sundays, in hurried coffees, in notes left on the fridge. There was still love. But sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes, love doesn't stop us from losing ourselves. It doesn't stop loneliness from growing within our own home. And it was in this growing emptiness that something began to shift. Without Daniel realizing it, Laura began searching for answers outside. Not in another body, yet, but in conversations he didn't know about, in connections she kept secret. Perhaps trying to fill the space he could no longer reach. Perhaps trying to discover who she was without him. And he, in turn, began to immerse himself more and more in work, in friends, in everything that would distract him from the feeling that something was slipping through the cracks in the life they had built together. They remained together. They continued to sleep side by side. But intimacy, the kind that sustains difficult days, had become an effort. And when love becomes an effort, when touch becomes an obligation, when dialogue becomes a formality, something needs to change. And something did. Not yet visible. Not yet declared. But enough to put everything they had built at risk. And at this point in history, nothing had yet been exposed. There were no scandals. There were no screams. There was only a love resisting, on the brink of the abyss, trying to survive the silence that grew between them. And it would be precisely this silence that, later on, would scream louder than any truth. Because what comes next will not be a sudden explosion, but the result of everything that remained silent. Of everything they left unsaid. Of everything they pretended not to see. And when the truth finally revealed itself, there would be no going back. Because some choices, even silent ones, have the power to change everything forever. Time passed like warm late afternoon winds, unhurried, but carrying with it things that once seemed solid. The following months were marked by a strange sense of mechanical normalcy, as if Laura and Daniel were acting in a play written years ago, with memorized lines and gestures that no longer came from the heart. They still shared the same space, the same roof, the same commitments, but something invisible weighed heavily between them, a veil of silence and disconnection that neither of them could, or perhaps even wanted, to tear completely. Intimacy gave way to formality, spontaneity became rehearsal, and touch was no longer shelter, but habit. Daniel, always so attentive to detail, sensed something in Laura changing subtly, as if harboring a sadness or a desire that cannot be expressed aloud. Her eyes had a strange glow, as if her mind wandered to places where he was not included. And though he tried not to feed ghosts, he began to notice that she became more distant in the simplest moments, their shared breakfast became a hurried ritual, her cell phone never left her hand, and the smiles, those light, easy smiles that had enchanted him, were increasingly rare. Daniel tried to rekindle their bond the only way he knew how, by offering his presence. He prepared dinners with her favorite recipes, tried to suggest weekend outings, and even created a playlist featuring the songs that marked the beginning of their relationship. In response, he received small gestures of gratitude, but not the enthusiasm he expected. It was like watering a plant that was already dry inside. Love, which had once been an exchange, now felt like charity. And Laura, even surrounded by care, seemed increasingly restless. She spoke more vaguely about her days, avoided details, was more distracted by her cell phone than by the conversation, and whenever Daniel asked if everything was okay, she smiled with a just tiredness that hid much more than fatigue. Doubt began to grow inside him like a bitter seed. Was there someone else? Or was he becoming invisible inside his own house? Amidst this silent imbalance, an invitation to a year-end celebration organized by mutual friends arrived. An intimate party, something more private, with people they both knew. Laura showed some enthusiasm, which surprised Daniel. She said she would go alone, knowing he had an important meeting the next morning and didn't want him to get tired. It was understandable, and he believed her. He still trusted her. He still believed that, despite the distance, there was a bond between them that couldn't be broken so easily. On the night of the party, she emerged dressed with a care he hadn't seen in a long time. Her perfume was striking, her hair tied back with an unpretentious charm, her eyes lit up as if she were about to rediscover a piece of herself. He complimented her, smiling, and she thanked him with a kiss on the cheek, as if thanking him for a gift she hadn't asked for. She left, leaving a sweet scent in the air and an absence heavier than the previous ones. Hours later, something inside him began to sting. A restlessness difficult to explain, as if his instincts were screaming through his rationality. The meeting had been cancelled mid-afternoon, but he decided not to tell her. There was something he wanted to understand for himself, something he needed to see with his own eyes. He got in his car, drove silently to the party venue, and entered without warning. It was a house with low music, warm lights, and a garden decorated with candles. People laughed in small groups, wine glasses in their hands, and the mood was light. But he wasn't looking for anyone but her. And he found her. At the bottom of the garden, among the faint shadows of the trees, was Laura. With him. A man Daniel had never seen. Their hands touched intimately. Their eyes spoke silently. And when she rested her head on his shoulder, Daniel froze. His breath caught, his chest tightened. It was as if he were outside his own body, watching his own fall. There was no kiss. There was nothing overtly reprehensible. But the gesture was enough. It was too much affection to be innocent. It was too much complicity to be friendship. Laura's gaze roamed the man's face gently, and it was at that moment, precisely at that instant, that she saw him. Her eyes met Daniel's in the darkness. A second of paralysis. A second where the whole world seemed to stop. He said nothing. Neither did she. Her body took a step forward, as if trying to justify, as if trying to chase after what had been broken. But he turned his back before another word could be spoken. He left the party without looking back. And as he drove through the empty night streets, the silence within him screamed truths he couldn't yet name. The next morning, Laura arrived home with her face drawn, her eyes sunken, and her breathing ragged. She tried to speak. She tried to explain. But Daniel wouldn't listen. What needed to be understood had already been seen. The pain he felt was too deep to be patched up with apologies. And yet, there was a sadness in his eyes that went beyond anger. It wasn't just hurt, it was disappointment. It was the death of a trust built with so much effort. And Laura knew it. He knew he'd crossed a line. I knew I would lose more than a relationship. I was losing the man who knew her best, listened to her best, held her most silently. And he, even torn apart inside, maintained his usual calm. He didn't yell. He didn't demand. He simply communicated, firmly and painfully, that he needed some time. That the house could no longer hold them both. And she, without the strength to argue, left with a suitcase in her hands and a void on her shoulders. In the days that followed, Daniel sank into a state of torpor. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He simply existed. His friends tried to be there, but he preferred silence. He read a lot. He walked around the city. He watched couples on the streets and tried to understand where he'd lost his way. At some point, he even believed he'd failed. That perhaps he hadn't loved enough, that perhaps his calm way of loving had been interpreted as coldness. But over time, he realized he'd given everything he could. That he'd been whole, even when she was already half gone. And this awareness gradually transformed the pain into clarity. Laura, however, didn't disappear. She continued sending spaced messages, trying to maintain some contact, saying she regretted it, that it had all been an emotional mess. But Daniel didn't respond. The pain was still too fresh to allow any dialogue that wouldn't bleed further. And then came the day of decision. An important event, an inevitable reunion. Mutual friends organized another party, this time to celebrate one of their birthdays. Laura was going. Daniel too. There was a tension in the air that no one could name, but everyone could feel. He decided to go. Not to confront her. Not to provoke her. But to close, once and for all, that chapter that still hurt. He dressed simply. Hair tidy, beard clean-shaven, gaze steady. Upon arriving, he greeted everyone politely and found a more private corner. And it was there that she saw him. For the first time since their separation, their eyes met again. There was no longer surprise. There was guilt. And there was pain. Laura approached slowly. She tried to smile. But he didn't return it. It was at that moment, in the middle of the room, amidst soft lights and low music, that something unexpected happened. A woman, previously unknown to everyone there, approached Daniel with a soft smile. She touched his arm lightly, whispered something in his ear, and they both smiled. It was a simple smile, but full of meaning. And Laura understood. She understood that perhaps, for the first time, she was no longer a part of his life. She understood that the void she had left was beginning to be filled. And that broke her insides. More than 1,000 words, that simple gesture hit her like a mirror showing everything she had thrown away. Remorse came like a blow. And regret, like a chain tightening around her chest. Daniel looked at her one last time. There was peace in his gaze. And it was in that moment that she knew, he had forgiven her. But he wouldn't return. And that was the greatest punishment. Because love isn't begged for. Love is cared for. And she didn't. But what Laura didn't know yet, what no one there imagined, was that behind that story of estrangement, behind that seemingly banal betrayal, there was something much greater hidden. Something that would change everything. Something that would transform regret into a silent and devastating punishment. Something that was yet to be revealed. Their final reunion happened almost by accident, though they both knew, deep down, that it would happen one day. Laura showed up at the coffee shop they used to go to years ago, now by chance, or perhaps by unconscious impulse. Daniel was there. Time had passed, and there was a solid serenity about him, a steady presence, like someone who has overcome deep pain without forgetting where it came from. She sat 2 tables away, hesitant, looking at her hands. He saw her. He showed no surprise, no coldness. He simply observed her for a second too long to be neutral. She stood, walked toward him, and, her voice breaking, asked to talk. He hesitated, looked around, took a deep breath, and said yes. They walked to a nearby park, where dry leaves covered the ground and the air was as heavy as the silence between them. For minutes, they simply walked, as if the movement itself could dissolve the memories. Until she stopped and said, bluntly, that she needed to tell him everything. Everything that was trapped, everything that was hidden, everything that silence tried to protect. He said nothing. He just stared at her, his eyes calm but attentive. She took a deep breath, fighting the shame and the weight of the truth that had long been eating away at her. She said she didn't know where to begin. He, in a firm voice, told her to start with the reason. The real reason for everything. Laura trembled. She said that at first she hadn't wanted to deceive him, that she thought it was just confusion, that she needed to feel something new, different. That for a long time she had tried to deny to herself that she was needy, that she felt invisible, but that she had never wanted to hurt him. Daniel remained motionless, without anger on his face, just with the firmness of someone who wants to hear it through to the end. Then came something he hadn't expected. Laura said that the man she'd gotten involved with at the party, she'd known him from before. Long before all that. Daniel frowned, feeling a pang in his chest, but waited. Laura continued, more quietly, as if afraid even the trees would hear her. She said that years ago, when she and Daniel were just dating, she had a brief fling with this man. It was a no-strings-attached, fleeting affair, a passion that burned out quickly. When she met Daniel, she thought it was all over, that the past was buried. But it wasn't. She ran into him again, by chance, months before the party. They started talking, reminiscing, and she, without realizing it, slipped back into something she thought was over. She said that at first it was just conversations, then quick coffees, until they started seeing each other more frequently. But what Daniel didn't know, and what she had hidden from everyone, was that this man didn't want her back. Never did. He sought her out for revenge. Revenge for their sudden end in the past. He said she humiliated him, that she disappeared from his life without explanation, that she made promises she broke. And when she appeared again, fragile, lost within her own marriage, he saw the perfect opportunity. Daniel, who had been quiet until then, looked up and asked why she was telling him this only now. Why reveal this after so long, after so much pain? And that was when the cruelest truth came out. Laura began to cry. She said she tried to forget. That she was too ashamed. That the man had recorded videos of their encounters without her consent. That one day, when she tried to end things, he threatened to release the footage. He told her she had too much to lose. That her family would never forgive her. That her mother, already in poor health, couldn't handle a scandal. And then she gave in. Not out of love. But out of fear. Out of shame. And out of the guilt that silently consumed her. She said she felt dirty, that she hated herself for having let her life be controlled by someone who only wanted to destroy her. That after Daniel saw her at the party and walked away, the man disappeared completely, taking with him the evidence, the threats, and leaving only emptiness. Daniel felt his world spin. Not because of the scandal. But because of the enormity of what it all meant. She had traded love for a mistake. She had destroyed the trust they had built with a poisoned bond with the past. And most devastating of all, she had lived through it all in silence, without the courage to ask for help. But at the same time, he saw in her eyes a regret that wasn't theatrical. It was real. It was dirty, twisted, human. Laura knelt before him, in the middle of the park, saying she didn't want pity. That she asked for nothing more. She just wanted him to know. To at least understand the weight she carried every day. She said she woke up in the middle of the night, with the image of him leaving the party repeating like a nightmare. She said she could no longer bear to live with the feeling of having destroyed the only true love she had ever had. Daniel approached slowly. He knelt beside her. He took her hands. Tears streamed down his face too. Not of anger. Not of pity. But of the deep pain of recognizing that, despite everything, there was still love there. But a love that no longer served them both. Because true love also demands peace. And what they had now was just recycled pain. He hugged her. A long hug. Strong. Like someone saying goodbye to the part of themselves that remained with the other. And he whispered in her ear that he forgave her. That he held no hatred. That he desired no revenge. But that he would not return. That chapter was over. And that now, each of them needed to start over from where they had lost their way. She wept silently, her face buried in his chest, trying to cherish that moment as the last breath of a love that was once whole. He stood up. He looked at her one last time. He smiled tenderly. And he said he hoped she would forgive herself, too. Because sometimes, the greatest punishment isn't the abandonment of another. It's the abandonment of oneself. Laura remained kneeling for a few seconds. Staring at the ground. Listening to her own sobs. Knowing that embrace was the end. Not the beginning. And that from then on, she would have to rebuild her life with the pieces that remained. And Daniel, for the first time in a long time, felt light. Not because the pain was gone. But because now, at least, it had a name. And when pain has a name, it can be put in its rightful place. Stored where it no longer hurts. He walked away without looking back. Because everything I needed to see had already been seen. Everything I needed to hear had already been said. And everything I needed to feel, he had already felt. But as I moved on, I never imagined that closed chapter would still leave unexpected echoes. Because even when love ends, life continues to test how much we've truly learned from pain. And sometimes, it returns. In a different way. In a different form. With a different name. And that, was yet to come. From that last encounter in the park onward, life seemed to take on a new rhythm for them both, as if they had finally accepted that the love between them would not withstand the ruins that remained. Daniel walked away. Not abruptly, but with the gentleness of someone who knows that maintaining contact would only prolong an inevitable agony. He moved to another city weeks later, not to escape, but out of a need for new air, new faces, new places that didn't remind him of the home where he had built dreams that ended in silence. Laura, on the other hand, stayed. Not by choice, but by paralysis. She tried to move on with her life, but she couldn't get through a single day without feeling his presence in the little things. Daniel's ghost visited her in the streets, in the cafes, in the songs she tried to avoid. The emptiness she once felt inside now had a name, and the weight of that name was unbearable. Laura's mother, weakened, worsened after her daughter confided part of what had happened. She didn't talk about blackmail or the videos. She simply said she had betrayed someone who loved her. Her mother didn't say a word for a few moments. She just looked at her with a pained expression Laura would never forget. When she finally spoke, it was to say something her daughter never expected to hear: "You're just like your father." It destroyed her inside. The comparison with the man who had abandoned her as a child was like reliving all the traumas of her childhood. In the following days, Laura barely left the house. She wouldn't look in the mirror. She didn't have the courage to go out to places where she might run into people she knew. Guilt ate away at her like rust. On the other side, Daniel was slowly beginning to breathe a different air. In the new apartment, still smelling of fresh paint, there were few things. A few unopened boxes, rented furniture, nothing very personal. He was in no rush to start over. He spent his late afternoons walking along the boardwalk near the beach, listening to music on his headphones and observing the people around him. Solitude no longer hurt him. It was like a necessary silence to listen to his own soul. And it was on one of these afternoons that he met Marina. She was sitting on a bench, writing in a notebook, completely oblivious to the world around her. Daniel sat nearby, and he couldn't explain why, but something about her subtly drew him in. It wasn't exuberant beauty or overt charm. It was a kind of presence. When she dropped her pen and he bent down to pick it up at the same time, their eyes met. And it wasn't like his encounter with Laura. There was no electricity. There was peace. She thanked him with a gentle smile and went back to writing. He got up and left, but that night, he thought of her. In the following days, they met again at the same time, without scheduling. And soon, they began talking. Nothing deep at first, just brief exchanges about books, music, the weather. But Daniel felt that with Marina, he could be who he was now, not who he had been with Laura. Meanwhile, Laura received increasingly spaced visits from her mother, who now required intensive care. She tried to make amends with practical gestures, bringing medicine, preparing meals, but she knew this couldn't erase the disappointed look on the face of the woman who raised her alone. At night, Laura relived everything. The mistakes, the lies, the choices. She mentally replayed the scene at the party, Daniel's look in her eyes, his voice saying he forgave her but wouldn't return. And, worst of all, were the dreams. In almost all of them, Daniel was present. Sometimes he returned. Sometimes he ignored her. Sometimes he disappeared into the crowd. But in every dream, Laura woke with her heart in pieces. Time went on. Marina and Daniel began going out together. First for coffee, then dinner, then short weekends in quiet places. With her, Daniel discovered a different way of loving, lighter, freer of expectations. Marina didn't demand his completeness. She accepted his pauses, his absences, his silences. And, little by little, he began to let her occupy spaces within himself that had been locked away since Laura. One day, walking hand in hand through a street fair, Marina told her she didn't need to know about his past if he didn't want to tell her. That what mattered was the present. Daniel thanked her with a restrained smile, but there, he understood he was ready to look forward. For the first time in years, Laura's name didn't come to mind when he felt a kiss. Laura learned about Daniel's new relationship through social media. She saw a photo of him smiling next to Marina at a beachside restaurant. His face was peaceful. That peace she had destroyed. That peace that, no matter how hard she tried to regain, she knew would never be hers again. She tried not to feel jealous. But she did. She tried not to compare herself. But she did. And that night, she had a panic attack. She woke up suffocating, trembling, unable to breathe. She called her mother, who simply replied, "You need to get help. And it's not from me." She decided to go to therapy. For the first time, she sat down in front of someone and told them everything. From beginning to end. She talked about her relationship with Daniel, the betrayal, the blackmail, the guilt, the fear. The therapist listened, without judgment. She said that regret is important, but that it only has value if followed by responsibility. And that Laura needed to stop waiting for punishment and start forgiving herself. The sessions became the only place where she could breathe. And, little by little, she began to understand that the destruction she had caused wasn't just about Daniel. It was about what she allowed others to do to her. About how she had lost herself. A year passed. Daniel and Marina decided to move in together. It wasn't a perfect relationship, but it was genuine. Marina knew there were scars, but she never tried to erase them. She knew when Daniel's silence was longing, knew when he needed space. And Daniel, in turn, began to allow himself to be with her again. Laura, now more stable, continued her life at a slow pace. She cared for her mother, wrote short texts that she never published, and sometimes walked alone through the streets where she used to walk hand in hand with Daniel. One day, she ran into him by chance. He was with Marina, smiling, carrying grocery bags. She considered leaving, but something made her stay. She approached. Daniel saw her first. There was no shock. There was no anger. Just a slight nod. She stopped in front of him and said she was happy to see him well. Daniel responded with a sincere, "Thank you." Marina, discreet, stood by, silent. Laura looked into his eyes and said she still dreamed about him sometimes. Daniel replied that he did too. But now, with the future. She smiled, with pain, but also with a strange sense of peace. Because there, in that brief encounter, she understood that the chapter had, indeed, ended. Not with anger. Not with sorrow. But with the acceptance that love, when left untended, dies. And that when it dies, what remains is learning. And that day, upon returning home, for the first time in a long time, Laura wrote something that wasn't a rant. It was a farewell. She wrote, "I loved you the wrong way. And you loved me in the most beautiful way anyone has ever been loved. It took me a while to understand the value of that. But today, I know. And that's why I can finally say goodbye." And that silent, painful, but necessary goodbye was the first step toward her being able to dream of the future one day. Without regret. Without guilt. Only with the hope that, even after the worst, there's still room to rebuild. Even if it's just herself. Laura spent days reliving that brief encounter, like someone trying to absorb the last seconds of a dream they know will never return. There was something in that moment that couldn't be put into words, a mixture of liberation and punishment, a kind of belated lucidity that burns more than it consoles. Seeing Daniel happy, stable, loving and being loved by someone who looked at him with lightness, was like holding a mirror up to herself and accepting, defenselessly, the reflection of what was lost forever. She didn't cry that day, didn't blame herself or martyr herself, but when she returned home, she opened one of the old boxes where she kept mementos from the past, letters, notes, photographs, movie tickets, and other remnants of a time that no longer existed. She held a photo of the two of them taken during a trip they had taken in their 3rd year of dating, smiling in front of a cloudy landscape, and understood that that memory no longer hurt as it once did. It was just an image, a frozen memory, beautiful and distant, no longer inhabiting the present. It wasn't Daniel she couldn't get over, it was herself at that time, when she still recognized herself as someone capable of loving properly. The following days were marked by a silent process of acceptance. Life continued with its sluggish routine, but now there was a new kind of movement within it, the search for the true meaning of what was left. Laura was still in therapy, but for the first time, she wasn't going there to talk about regret or guilt, but rather to understand the woman she was trying to become. She no longer wrote about pain, but about starting over. Little by little, she reconnected with friends she'd previously avoided out of shame, began participating in reading groups, and dedicated herself to small social projects. She discovered that, although she couldn't erase what she'd done, she could, yes, rebuild herself. Quietly, without fanfare, without trying to prove anything to anyone. Simply by being better. More whole. More complete. Daniel, in turn, immersed himself more and more in his relationship with Marina. She wasn't a replacement, and he knew that from the start. It was a new beginning. A new construction, built on the maturity that grief brought him. The two cultivated a relationship based on respect, care, and listening. Marina was gentle but firm, respecting his space while still maintaining her presence. She didn't ask questions about the past, but listened attentively when he opened up. And Daniel, little by little, became more open, less restrained, less concerned with maintaining control over everything. He allowed himself to laugh out loud, make mistakes, and show fear, things he'd previously camouflaged with the false stability of someone who believes they need to be the pillar of everything. For the first time, he felt like he was in a space where he was loved for who he was, not for who they expected him to be. One day, at a dinner with friends, Marina surprised him with a simple but profound speech. She told him how Daniel had transformed her understanding of love. She said he was present even when he didn't speak, that she had learned from him that love doesn't need to be demonstrated in grand gestures, but sustained in daily choices, in the care of those who stay even when the other fails, and that this had completely changed her way of loving. Daniel, hearing this, felt a lump in his throat. Because, even if Marina didn't know it, she was describing exactly the kind of love he once offered Laura, but now, in another time, with another person, it was finally being recognized and valued. Meanwhile, Laura's mother was hospitalized after a severe respiratory crisis. Laura spent days in the hospital, alternating between care, prayer, and long conversations with doctors. Their relationship was never sweet, but there was an unbreakable bond, marked by hurt, silence, and affection that was never fully expressed. One night, when the room was silent and the low light cast shadows on the walls, her mother held her hand with difficulty and said something she had never said before: "You made bad choices, but you are still my daughter. And I made mine too. No woman escapes her own pain unscathed. Don't condemn yourself for wanting to love wrongly. But promise me that from now on, you will love rightly." Laura cried like a child. Not only because she heard the voice of someone who had always been tough become soft, but because she knew that this might be the last apology her mother would ever make. And in that moment, she felt she could finally put her shame behind her. In one of her therapy sessions, Laura revealed she felt a strange urge to write a letter to Daniel. Not to get back together. Not to win him back. Just to thank him. For everything. For the way he loved her, for the way he forgave her, for being the most sincere mirror she'd ever had. The therapist said it could be a good symbolic closure. And so she wrote. A long, deep, honest letter. She spoke of the past, what she'd learned, how much she'd made mistakes, and how much she was still in process. She said she hoped he would remain happy and that, truly, she hoped Marina would be everything she couldn't be. He put the letter in an envelope but didn't send it. He realized, when he finished, that it wasn't necessary. That letter was for her. A final gesture of liberation. Around the same time, Marina lost her father. It was a painful process, as the bond between them was strong. Daniel remained present throughout her grief, taking care of the little things she could no longer do alone. And during this time, something within him solidified: that woman was now his home. And he was ready for something bigger. He began discreetly planning a trip to propose to Marina. It wasn't about forgetting the past, but about embracing the present with everything he had learned. He prepared everything calmly, with details he had thought through for months. It wasn't extravagant, but it was intimate, deep, and genuine, just like he was. During this same period, Laura began teaching at a neighborhood school. She rediscovered a joy she had forgotten. The students looked at her with admiration, and she felt useful and inspiring. She began writing short stories, using fictitious names but portraying feelings she knew well. One of the stories ended up being published in a literary magazine. She read the printed text as if seeing a part of her soul take shape. For the first time in a long time, she felt proud of herself. Without needing anyone's validation. It was in this scenario, where everything seemed to be falling into place, that time finally fulfilled its role, teaching us that some stories don't have happy endings in the romantic sense, but rather honest, profound, and just ones. Stories that transform us, that confront us with our flaws and force us to choose who we want to be based on them. Laura learned to live without looking back, without waiting for messages that would never come, without harboring empty hopes. Daniel learned that moving forward isn't about running away, but about understanding that some loves only serve to teach. Marina learned that loving someone who's been broken requires courage, but that when you choose to rebuild together, life takes care of making things blossom. And at that point in life, all paths were ready for a new direction. The descending action of that story wasn't about erasing what had happened, but about allowing each person to move on in peace with the consequences of their choices. Laura, now serene, walked alone not out of loneliness, but out of freedom. Daniel, about to make the greatest gesture of a new beginning since everything fell apart, carried the certainty that loving again was possible, and that, this time, he was where he truly deserved to be. Marina, unaware of the full depth of the story that preceded their love, was the present that needed no past to be worthwhile. Time, which had once seemed like an enemy, was now an ally. And everything moved, silently, toward an end no one expected, but which, somehow, would reveal itself as the only possible conclusion to a story of love, loss, learning, and rebirth. It was on a Sunday afternoon, without warning and for no apparent reason, that Laura decided to walk to the garden where, months before, she had knelt before Daniel to confess everything she had kept silent for too long. She didn't know what she was looking for there, perhaps simply to confirm to herself that that chapter was truly closed, or perhaps she simply wanted to see with her own eyes if the pain that once overwhelmed her still found a place within her. The place was nearly empty, and the dry leaves that covered the path seemed to have accumulated the echoes of what had been experienced there. She sat on the same stone bench, closed her eyes for a few seconds, and didn't think about Daniel as before. She thought about herself. About how she had changed. About how she was still changing. It was at that moment that her phone vibrated in her pocket. It was a message from her sister, saying that her mother had taken a sudden turn for the worse. Laura rushed to the hospital without thinking. Upon arriving, she found the room silent, her mother's frail body surrounded by machines that beeped in a tense, erratic rhythm. He sat down beside her, held her wrinkled hand, and realized how much more there was to say, even if, at that moment, the words seemed useless. In the silence of the room, she whispered that she forgave her, that she understood her now as never before, that she recognized the weight of being a woman and carrying so much hidden pain. She said that, despite all the conflicts, she had been the pillar that kept her standing when everything around her was crumbling. And, with teary eyes, she thanked her. Not for everything, but for so much. For her courage, for her presence, for her twisted love, but love nonetheless. Her mother didn't respond. There was no exchange of glances or final words. Only the sound of the monitors, which shortly after were replaced by a continuous, dry alarm. She was gone. There. Without a goodbye. And Laura remained, sitting, her head bowed and her hand still clutching hers as if she could stop time from taking what little she had left. Grief descended like a heavy, but not despairing, veil. For the first time, Laura experienced loss with the knowledge that she had done what she could. That the gaps between her and her mother had been filled, albeit late, with something resembling forgiveness. And this feeling, strange and comforting, gave her the strength to face the days that followed. She attended the wake calmly, welcomed the family with kindness, and amidst all the social rituals of mourning, she realized she no longer needed to hide who she was. She no longer felt ashamed of the woman she had become. She knew her flaws, but she also knew the silent effort she had been making to be better. Meanwhile, Daniel's life was moving toward a new and definitive milestone. The trip with Marina was set. It was to the countryside, a small town with a crystal-clear lake surrounded by rustic cottages. He chose the place because it reminded him of the peace he once sought within himself and now found in her eyes. Marina suspected nothing, but Daniel carried in his pocket a simple ring with a small diamond attached to a red thread, the same one he'd worn on his wrist as a charm since he met her. It was his way of symbolizing that the paths that brought them together came from something greater than coincidence. On the night of the proposal, the sky was clear and the air slightly chilly. They walked barefoot by the lake, and Marina talked about how the sound of the water reminded her of her childhood. Daniel stopped, took her hand, and made her sit beside him on a smooth rock. He was silent for a few seconds, then spoke in a low but firm voice. He said he had never promised anything to anyone he wasn't sure he could keep, and that with her, he wanted to promise everything. He said he wasn't a perfect man, that he carried stories and scars, but that with her, he felt he no longer needed to protect himself. He wanted to be whole, not only to love, but to share, to build, to grow old. Marina didn't cry. She smiled. And, holding his face in her hands, she responded with a kiss. A calm kiss, as if saying yes with her soul. The yes came later, of course, amid laughter and tears. But the true commitment had already been sealed in the silence of that moment, where two truths met. The following week, back in the city, Daniel decided to visit the grave of his father, who had died years before. He wanted to talk to someone about this new step in life, even if that person was no longer there. He brought flowers, carefully cleaned the marble, and spoke loudly, as he had as a child. Marina stood at a distance, respecting his space. On the way out, they passed a small flower shop, and upon seeing an elderly woman sitting at the counter, Marina decided to go in. They talked for a few minutes, and the woman, with sweet eyes, said she had recently lost her husband. Daniel, upon hearing her speak, approached. And the woman, after briefly telling her story, said a phrase that stuck with him for days: "Sometimes the love of our life isn't the one who stays, it's the one who teaches us to recognize the right love when it finally arrives." Marina looked at Daniel and squeezed his hand. He smiled, a certain heaviness in his gaze, but with a light heart. As the discreet wedding preparations began, Laura made an important decision. She decided to publish a book. Not an autobiography, but a collection of fictional short stories inspired by real feelings. Stories about loss, new beginnings, forgiveness, and rebuilding. She chose a pseudonym, not out of fear, but so the texts could speak for themselves. When the publisher approved the material, she cried. Not out of sadness, but because she understood that, even after everything, it was still possible to flourish. One of the stories described a woman who had betrayed the man who loved her and spent years trying to make sense of the emptiness that remained. The story ended with the character planting a garden over the ashes of the house she once destroyed with her own hands. It was symbolic. And necessary. One night, walking through one of the downtown bookstores, Daniel saw the book in the window. He picked up the copy out of curiosity, flipped through a few pages, and after reading 2 paragraphs, he recognized something in the style, the words, the pain contained between the lines. He had no doubt it was Laura. He read the entire book in 2 nights. He didn't cry, but he felt a silent gratitude. For her having found a way. For choosing to transform pain into art. And for, even indirectly, still being able to touch him with truth. Days later, as he left a cafe with Marina, he saw Laura across the street, emerging from a newsstand with a newspaper tucked under her arm. Their eyes met. And this time, there was no wait. Just a slight, almost imperceptible nod. There was no desire to talk. Nor any need. They both knew there were no more chapters to be written between them. Just a story closed, respected, and finally overcome. The two followed paths that would never cross again, but that could never deny what they represented to each other. Because sometimes the greatest love stories aren't the ones that last forever, but the ones that leave scars that become maps that, if read with courage, lead us exactly where we should be. And everything, now, pointed to the end. Not as a tragedy, but as a conclusion. As the necessary final point in a narrative that, though marked by pain, was reborn in the form of forgiveness, learning, and a new beginning. And the true outcome, this one, was already approaching like the last breath of an ancient wind, finally preparing to die down. Daniel and Marina's wedding was simple yet meaningful. A private, outdoor setting, surrounded by ancient trees and lit by small lamps strung between the branches, they were surrounded only by their closest friends, those who had closely witnessed the rebirth of a man who had been shattered inside but found the strength to rebuild, not through a new love, but through the choice not to become bitter in the face of disappointment. When Daniel looked at Marina at the altar, he realized that the love he now experienced was not a replacement for the previous one, but the evolution of everything he once believed impossible to experience again. There was no weight of past memories in her gaze, only the lightness of the present, as if every pain he had experienced up until that point made sense for having led him to this very moment. Marina, with her calm eyes and her constant presence, had not come to erase anyone, but to teach that a wounded heart can indeed trust again and that true love does not compete with the past, it only blossoms where there is space. After the ceremony, Daniel discreetly stepped away for a few minutes and walked to a part of the field where he had left a small letter pinned to a tree. It was for himself, written months earlier, in a moment of solitude. When he opened the envelope, he read silently, "If you've made it this far, then understand, you won. Not because you overcame someone, but because you didn't allow pain to transform you into what hurt you. And because you knew how to recognize love when it came, without expecting perfection, only truth." He carefully folded the paper, tucked it into his inside jacket pocket, and returned to the party with his soul at peace. Life had taught him, in the harshest way possible, that to love is also to know how to let go. But now, he finally understood what it meant to stay. That same night, Laura was home alone, sitting on the sofa with a cup of tea in her hands and a book open on her lap. She didn't know exactly why, but she felt a restlessness in the air. A premonition. As if something were closing inside her for good. She turned on the television but didn't pay attention. The phone rang. It was a friend telling her that her book had been nominated for a National Literary Award. The news took her by surprise. It was recognition. It was validation that her pain, when transformed into truth, could touch others. She wept silently, not for the nomination, but for the symbolism of it all. Because she had written those stories on sleepless nights, on anguished afternoons, in moments when she didn't know if she could continue. She got up, went to the balcony, and looked up at the sky. She took a deep breath. She understood then that, even if she would never receive forgiveness from the entire world, she had finally forgiven herself. Days passed, and shortly after, Laura received an unexpected message. It was from Marina. Direct, calm, without irony. It invited her to a charity literary event where they would both be present as guests. Laura hesitated. She considered refusing. But something inside her told her this invitation was more than a formality. It was a chance. Not for rapport, not for friendship, but to face the new reality head-on. She accepted. On the day of the event, she arrived early and sat in the third row, observing the preparations. When Marina entered, accompanied by Daniel, their eyes inevitably met. Laura didn't look away. She smiled lightly. And Marina, with the same serenity she always carried, returned the gesture with a subtle wave. Daniel simply held his gaze firmly, respectfully, and moved on. There was no conversation. There was no need for more. But in that silent exchange, something ended forever. It was the last page being turned, without shouts, without tears, only with the maturity of someone who understood that loving also means knowing how to let go. That same week, Laura's book was officially released in a new edition. She took the stage at the local theater to give thanks, and during her speech, she didn't mention any personal tragedy, but spoke instead about the second chances life gives to those who don't give up trying to be better. She said that everyone makes mistakes, but that mistakes don't have to be the end of everything, as long as we take responsibility for them truthfully and don't try to escape the consequences. The applause at the end was intense. And for the first time in many years, Laura felt her voice came not from guilt, but from honesty. As for the man who had once been the catalyst for the mistake that destroyed everything, he disappeared forever. Never seen again. For Laura, that no longer mattered. He no longer had power. Because now, she knew that what truly matters is not what is done to us, but what we choose to do with what hurt us. And she chose to no longer be a victim. Not of others, nor of herself. Daniel and Marina moved on with their lives in harmony. They had a son years later, and when he held him in his arms for the first time, Daniel understood that love can multiply when we make room for it. There were no more bitter memories, no more fears. There was only the present, and gratitude for everything that brought him to this point. He knew, with the certainty that only time can give, that if he hadn't suffered what he did, he might never have learned to value love in its most honest form. And that was what he wanted to teach his son, that love is not the absence of error, but the presence of choice. Every day. Choosing the other. Choosing to stay. Choosing to care. Years later, Laura still walked the city streets alone, but now with a firm step. She published 2 more books. She gave interviews. She was invited to give lectures. She never remarried, but she also never lost herself to anyone. She loved, yes. But now with awareness, without needing to deny herself, without trying to fit into anyone's expectations. She lived her own truth with courage. And that, for her, was enough. The scar in her history would never disappear, but she learned to use it as a mark of transformation. Every time she looked back, she didn't see destruction. She saw rebirth. This was a story about choices. About consequences. About loss. But, above all, about redemption. Not the redemption we seek in others, but the kind that only comes when we stop pretending we didn't make mistakes and have the courage to face what we've done. Daniel found peace by moving forward without holding grudges. Laura found freedom by no longer hiding from her own pain. And Marina, with her loving presence, was proof that true love doesn't need to fix anything, it just needs to respect what has already been experienced. Comment below what you thought of this story. Which part touched you most? Which character did you relate to the most? Your opinion is important, and we want to know how this story touched your heart. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future stories like this. And remember, betrayal isn't a mistake, it's a choice. And every choice has consequences. Sometimes, what you lose never comes back. A home can be destroyed in minutes, a love can be murdered by a fake hug, and trust, oh, trust, once broken, is never whole again. This story showed that even those who betray can change, but that lost love will never be the same. And here on this channel, we make it clear, we do not support any kind of betrayal. Our purpose is to show, through fictional stories, the real damage it causes, to love, to family, to the soul. Until the next story. And may it not come from pain.